The tale unfolds as the main character, Aram, undergoes a sudden and dramatic shift in her life. Struck by the infamous Trakoon, she finds herself transported to a fantastical realm known as Soul. However, this isn't the typical teleportation that bestows superpowers upon the protagonist. Instead, Aram becomes entangled in a dark situation, captured by slavers who auction her off as a vampire. Despite the fantastical setting, Aram possesses no supernatural abilities, and her new reality is far from the typical hero's journey. The auctioneer sets her price at 1,500 gold pieces, labeling her as a vampire in a world where such creatures are feared. Unfortunately, no buyers show interest, as vampires are considered too spooky. Ultimately, she is purchased by the House of Duke and escorted to the palace. Throughout this bewildering journey, Aram is visibly shaken, her fear and confusion apparent as she grapples with the abrupt changes in her life. The Duke's representative warns her about the dangerous nature of Duke Millard, emphasizing that he might devour her if displeased. Expecting a ferocious beast, Aram is shocked when she finally meets Duke Millard, who turns out to be a surprisingly pleasant man. Curious, he asks her if she is truly a vampire. In her confusion, she denies it, and that's when Millard's excitement turns into utter disappointment. It turns out Duke Millard had unknowingly purchased a vampire from a mystical equivalent of Wishcom, the budget-friendly alternative to genuine supernatural creatures. Realizing he had been scammed, Millard is left speechless. He had spent a small fortune expecting a creature of the night, only to receive someone with 0 vampire perks. In a sudden brainwave, Millard beckons her closer. Cautiously, Aram approaches, only for the eccentric Duke to seize her hand and bite it. To his horror, her blood tastes awful, causing him to spit it out immediately. Aram, bewildered and confused, wonders why this oddball is gnawing on her hand. She begins to worry that Millard might decide to kill her due to her subpar blood. Meanwhile, Millard scratches his head, puzzled by what kind of creature Aram could be. Not quite human, but certainly not a vampire. As he contemplates the situation, Aram realizes her best shot at survival is to offer her services. She pleads, claiming she's excellent at cleaning and laundry. However, Millard dismissively declares he has no need for that. Frustrated, Aram threatens to spill the beans about the scam. After some relentless pleading and negotiating, Duke Millard reluctantly agrees to keep her on as a maid. Escorted to her room by another maid, Aram finds solace in her tears, reminiscing about the family she has left behind. The next morning, Aram was greeted with a maid uniform, transforming her into the spitting image of a stereotypical maid. Baffled, she wondered why, in a place that supposedly hated vampires, they still had one serving them. Her first task of the day was to find the missing piece of a puzzle Duke Millard had been working on. Miraculously, she discovered it under his bed. Now entrusted with a new mission, Aram was asked to move some books to the study. The only problem, she had no idea where the study was. When she returned to Duke's room to ask for guidance, a knife whizzed past her head. With dramatic flair, Duke Millard pinned her against the wall, demanding to know who had given her permission to invade his space. Face to face with the imposing Duke, Aram felt her cheeks turn into mini Niagara Falls. Panicking, she stammered out an apology, which led the Duke to summon his right-hand man, Logan. Apparently Logan was the one who had won her at the auction for Duke Millard. Taking on the role of tour guide, Logan led Aram through the labyrinthine halls of the mansion. However, their grand tour was abruptly interrupted by a random maid, who whisked Aram away to the kitchen. There, she was entrusted with a new task, delivering a meal to Duke Millard. As Aram approached Millard's table, ready to carry out her culinary mission, he suddenly changed the script and ordered her to take a seat. Surprised, Aram complied. In the midst of the meal, with an air of suspicion, she suggested taste-testing the food for poison. Millard, seemingly unconcerned, agreed. But as Aram sampled the cuisine, Millard's keen vampire eyes spotted a bloodstain on her foot. Logan was quickly summoned to escort her to the medic. In the medical room, Aram met Marin, who wasted no time asking her age. A suspicious question. As they chatted, Aram couldn't help but notice Marin's striking resemblance to Harley Quinn from that Joker movie. After bandaging her wound, Marin sent her on her way. In a burst of whimsy, Millard gave Aram yet another unusual task, counting the number of times the word Miller appeared in a book. Aram dove into the literary challenge, working diligently and proudly presenting a grand total of 1,068. Little did she know, Millard was slightly taken aback by her accuracy, triggering a nostalgic flashback. As a child, he had been locked in a room with the same tedious counting chore. As the days rolled on, Aram found herself settling into the routine, though she still approached the food with caution, as if it held the secrets of the universe. She was also becoming quite familiar with Millard's temper, which seemed to revolve around an endless cycle of chores. One night, while delivering Millard's dinner, Aram sensed something was off. Concerned, she tried to act like a caring nurse, akin to friends trying to carry each other in a desperate unranked low-L game. Millard, however, brushed off her concern, ordering her to summon someone from the flora. Confused by the term, Aram sought guidance from the other maids, only to be met with cold indifference and some old-fashioned trash talk, fueled by their jealousy over her growing rapport with Millard. Undeterred, she approached the head maid and relayed Millard's request. Still baffled by what the flora was, she sought clarification from Ard, who was just as unhelpful. Later that night, Millard assigned her another task, reading out dates. But in a mild act of rebellion, Aram began to complain. The head maid barged in with urgent news, leading them to a room where Aram was instructed to fetch Marin. As they walked, Marin couldn't resist letting out some jealousy-laden complaints. Together they entered the room where Millard awaited, but, to Aram's surprise, a pink-haired person, who looked more like a femboy than a maid, was sitting on the bed. The figure introduced herself as Rose and, with a sly wink, inquired if Millard had found a partner for channeling his energy. Rose then dropped a bombshell about something called a decree hearing, leaving Aram utterly confused. Who knew vampire politics could be so convoluted? It turned out that the decree was akin to mortal-immortal marriage, with an added twist. If the mortal spouse managed to off the vampire duke, they would hit the jackpot of wealth. Talk about a financial plan with a deadly twist. Upon discovering this vampire matrimony hack from Rose, Aram realized that Millard had mistaken her kindness for an attempt at a decree partnership. Determined to clear things up, she bravely ventured into Millard's ominous room. In the shadow of his dark aura, she hesitated before mustering the courage to spill the tea. She clarified that she was only there to serve him out of goodwill and had no decree ambitions whatsoever. Rather than a stern response, Millard, captivated by her humble explanation, burst into laughter. The usually ferocious Duke, in an uncharacteristically gentle gesture, called her closer and patted her on the head like a fluffy kitten. The next day at the office, Aram decided to flaunt her creativity by crafting a paper crane. Little did she know, this innocent attempt at origami would backfire. Millard, eyeing the paper masterpiece, declared she should mass-produce them. Seeing his newfound interest, Aram suggested they team up for efficiency. After all, 2 cranes are better than 1, right? Initially reluctant due to his pride, Aram eventually gave in after witnessing Aram's crane-folding finesse. Once he was hooked, there was no turning back. Later that day, Aram stumbled upon the palace chapel, captivated by its beauty. The Pope, with his majestic presence, appeared to be the epitome of holiness. However, the initial charm faded quickly as the sermon transformed into what felt like a historical reenactment class. Yawn. Inducing, to say the least. The Pope then brought out a bucket containing a glowing holy concoction. Aram, wide-eyed, couldn't believe what she was seeing. The Pope invited attendees forward for a blessing. When it was Aram's turn, she chatted with him and found him surprisingly friendly, though she couldn't shake the feeling that he was a bit suspicious. The Pope inquired about Aram's backstory, but she skillfully dodged the question, claiming she had a date with Millard. Amused, the Pope, who revealed he had the same plans, suggested they go together. Arriving at Millard's room, the Pope proposed that Millard attend the blessing as well. However, Millard, acting like a bratty kid, initially declined. Instead, he opted for the more sophisticated activity of folding paper cranes with Aram. Despite Aram secretly wishing the Pope would join them, Millard's stubbornness won out. But then, out of the blue, Millard changed his mind and decided to attend. The Pope, thrilled by the unexpected turn of events, asked if he could have a private chat with Aram. However, Millard, with the grace of a protective older sibling, refused the request and shooed the Pope away. Before leaving, the Pope left Aram with a cryptic message. If she ever needed anything, she should reach out to him. Puzzled, Aram wondered if the Pope knew more about her than she thought. As they sat down to fold more paper cranes, Aram couldn't contain her confusion and asked why the Pope had referred to Millard as an elder. Millard revealed they were blood, but with a significant age gap. 16 to 17 generations, to be precise. Aram's shock was palpable. Family reunions in vampire circles must be quite the event. As time passed, Aram found herself settling into the routines of the vampire mansion. One fateful night, her beauty sleep was rudely interrupted by the head maid, who instructed her to fetch Millard from his office and bring him to his bedroom. "Oh, and there might be a dead body involved," the maid added with a deadpan expression, advising Aram to act surprised. Now that was a wake-up call. Entering Millard's room, Aram encountered quite the scene. Millard, decked out like an overrated anime protagonist, sword in hand with a blood-stained floor. Millard, channeling the calm demeanor of Keanu Reeves, questioned her intrusion. Ignoring his inquiry, Aram casually suggested a wardrobe change before she cleaned him up. Baffled by her lack of fear, Millard asked why she wasn't more alarmed. Aram, in her signature low-key manner, explained that sometimes she found him scary, and sometimes she didn't. Smoothly shifting the conversation, she then asked for the lowdown on the bloodbath. The next day, as Millard lounged in his office, he noticed Aram acting oddly and couldn't resist asking her about it. Quick on her feet, Aram claimed she was planning to discuss her hometown with the Pope. Surprisingly, Millard granted her permission. In the chapel, Aram stood before the Pope, but the real star of the moment was Marin, who revealed Aram's mysterious origins. The Pope decided to play detective, placing his thumb on Aram's forehead, causing a mysterious light to shine. Convinced by the divine glow, the Pope declared that Aram was not a vampire. Well, that settled it. Vampires were officially off the table. It seemed like Aram had received the papal seal of approval. Then, the Pope dropped a bombshell. Aram was neither human nor vampire, but something else. An empty shell. Curious, the Pope asked her to tell him more about herself, and Aram spilled the details like a clumsy waiter dropping a tray of drinks. Returning to Millard's office, she told him what had happened. In an oddly possessive mood, Millard bit his finger and left a bloody mark on her forehead. As if that weren't strange enough, he handed her a book titled Research on Blood Collection. The kind of book that might get you side-aimed at a library. Millard warned her that it was a banned and dangerous book. Panicked, Aram questioned why he'd give her such a thing. Millard claimed it was about vampires and urged her to read it. Little did she know, the book was a hot potato brought to Millard by assassins who had failed miserably in their attempt to take him down. That night, Logan dropped another bombshell. Count Freyner, the banned book enthusiast, had committed suicide, leaving a note blaming Millard. Now officially part of the vampire drama, Aram tagged along with Millard to the funeral. Freyner's son, however, wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, angrily blaming everything on Millard, but our unfazed Giga-Chad Millard paid his respects and dipped. On their way back, they swung by a jewelry store, where Millard told Aram to wait outside. As she stood there, a mysterious woman approached, eager to know more about Millard. Aram painted a vivid picture of him, like Picasso with words. Back at the palace and ready for maid duties, the head maid decided to pull a classic prank on Aram, sending her on an egg-fetching mission, only for Aram to find herself grabbing at thin air. Suddenly, a shadow emerged from the back door and snatched her, leaving behind just a lone shoe. When Aram woke up, she found herself in a wooden cabin, face to face with none other than the femboy-looking man, Urian Miller. The same Urian whose name she had counted in the Imperial Family Book. Talk about a weird family reunion. Fearful but trying to keep her cool, Aram listened as Urian promised to return her home if she answered some questions truthfully. Sensing her anxiety, Urian called his servant, who had brought her there. In a bizarre display of loyalty, or perhaps insanity, the servant poured hot coffee on his own head as a form of apology. And then, as if it were just another ordinary day, Urian casually ordered the poor soul's execution. As chaos was about to be unleashed, Aram, in an act of mercy, screamed for him to stop. Urian's twisted smile and response hinted at an even darker side lurking beneath the surface. He then spilled the beans on his real intentions. He wanted Aram to enter into a decree with Millard. To sweeten the deal, he dangled a hefty price for her cooperation. However, even in the midst of the madness, Aram saw through Urian's slimy facade. Back in the Duke's office, Millard was in full detective mode with the head maid, extracting every detail about Aram's connection to the head king. The head maid revealed Aram's current whereabouts: the Torring cabin. With determination, Millard marched toward the door, ready to reclaim what was his. The head maid, noticing his possessiveness, told him that she also wanted to know what Aram would choose, and if she'd be willing to betray him. Millard, sensing a potential love triangle, demanded that the head maid leave. Sitting back in his chair, he was convinced that the dashing Rizzler Urian had nefarious plans to charm Aram and snatch her away. After all, the man was undeniably handsome. Meanwhile, Aram stood her ground against Urian's decree proposal, bluntly telling him she had zero intentions of getting cozy with Millard in any form of matrimonial venture. Surprisingly, Urian was rather chill about it. He thanked her for her honesty and graciously allowed her to make a swift exit. Taking a carriage straight to the palace, Aram couldn't help but fret over what the Duke might think of her sudden disappearance. Gathering her courage, she ventured to Millard's room, only to find him in a state of sheer desperation. He burst out of the door like a bat out of hell. Overwhelmed, Aram began pouring her heart out about the cabin ordeal, but in a moment of impulsivity, Millard kissed her. The unexpected lip lock left Aram dazed, and Millard, seizing the moment, scooped her up and brought her inside. Once inside the room, Aram spilled the beans about the head maid's shady role, urging Millard to fire her. However, in a classic boss move, Millard defended the head maid's job performance. Confused, Aram asked why he hadn't come to her rescue at the cabin. Millard, leaving her to connect the dots, closed the curtains for added dramatic flair and embarked on a long exposition. He explained the imperial family's plot to make him mortal through a human-vampire union. The catch? The imperial family had a murderous vendetta against his potential wives, and he couldn't just marry a vampire bride from the realm he ruled. Oren, wide-eyed, learned the shocking truth. Whoever became Millard's wife would have a target on their back from day one, and now, to complicate things further, the second prince had decided to play the sugar daddy card with Aram. Next thing she knew, he sent her a pair of shoes. And not just any shoes. Millard even took a mold of her feet to ensure a perfect fit. Now that's commitment. Aram, intrigued but cautious about Millard's potential reaction, stashed the shoes under her bed for safekeeping. However, when she ventured into Millard's room, bracing for the inevitable interrogation, he surprised her by not getting mad at all. Instead, he casually told her to use the gift and any other fabulous products she received. To up the ante in the gift war, Millard whisked Aram away to an upscale royal shoe shop. There, they encountered a snooty shopkeeper who initially refused to serve Aram, judging her by her maid uniform. Realizing it wasn't good for business, the shopkeeper eventually caved and showcased their shoe collection. Aram, with her simple tastes, aimed for practical shoes, but Millard had other plans, selecting a flashy pair for her. Just when Aram thought the gift saga was over, the second prince struck again, this time gifting her an apron. This time, Millard didn't reciprocate, sensing the escalating gift warfare. Concerned, Aram approached him, requesting he call off the prince. Despite his usual moody demeanor, Millard reluctantly agreed. To smooth things over, Aram decided to apologize with a personal touch: flower power. She bought Millard some flowers and attached a heartfelt note about how much she appreciated his gifts. However, instead of receiving gratitude, she was met with cold dismissal. Confused by his abrupt reaction, Aram left the room, leaving Millard alone with his newfound flower fragrance obsession. Later that night, Aram woke up to find herself surrounded by a bizarre assortment of flowers, a weird midnight floral surprise, courtesy of the eccentric vampire duke. As she rushed out of her room, she was accused by an irate maid of breaking a glass vase. Aram, innocent as a kitten, protested, but the maid wasn't having it. With a sigh, Aram agreed to clean up the mess. Just another day in the vampire mansion. Undeterred, she made her way to Millard's dark and mysterious room, where the curtains were tightly drawn, blocking out any hope of daylight. While pouring hot water for Millard, she mustered the courage to express her gratitude for the gifts, though she hinted at the discomfort they brought her. Millard, seemingly understanding, promised to ease up on the extravagant gifting. Then came the strange request: the blue teapot. As Aram scoured the mansion for it, Millard dropped the bomb that it was poisoned. She was then tasked with another errand, this time to retrieve a box with a bead. Hoping for a less lethal assignment, Aram set out. In a cinematic flashback, Millard reminisced about creating the blue teapot himself. Because, as a vampire, he enjoyed the taste of poison, and being immortal, it didn't bother him. Just your average vampire with a weird palate. As Aram continued her search for the bead box, she crossed paths with the angry maid from earlier, who now accused her of snitching to the Duke. Baffled, Aram denied the allegations, but before she could protest further, the maid locked her out in the cold confines of the bathing area. Fortunately, a maid named Isabel came to Aram's rescue and escorted her back to her room. Isabel informed the Duke about the incident, and he was not pleased. Angry, he stormed to Aram's room to check on her. Millard, showing a surprisingly softer side, blanketed Aram in not one, not two, but 3 layers of warmth, practically turning her into a human marshmallow. Feeling like a mummy in a snowstorm, Aram bravely requested the removal of at least 1 layer. After a heated debate, Millard reluctantly agreed to peel off a blanket, revealing a slightly less bundled Aram. In a moment of rare seriousness, Millard apologized to Aram, promising to change his ways. He acknowledged that he hadn't been the most careful caretaker and that Aram's condition was proof of that. Just as things were starting to calm down, the Pope, the holy light enthusiast, made an entrance. Ordered by Millard to fix Aram, the Pope, with all his knowledge of her past life and emptiness, hesitated before applying his holy touch to her forehead. Millard, unimpressed, found the whole blessing affair annoying, and the Pope eventually made his exit. Curious about Millard's displeasure, Aram asked for an explanation, but he brushed her off, sending her back to sleep. Little did she know, Millard was about to unleash a fit of vampire rage on the entire servant crew. Gathering the terrified servants in the hall, Millard singled out the maid responsible for locking Aram in the bathing area. In a twisted display of vampire justice, he forced her to drink poison, and the poor maid spat blood like an extra in a horror movie. Satisfied with his dramatic execution, Millard left the servants with a stern warning: never touch his maid again. Later, Millard visited Aram and told her that he would be moving her to a new room because her current one was too far away. He modified several things in the palace for her comfort. When Aram woke up in her new, improved room, she marveled at the cozy surroundings. Even the vampire lord's room was conveniently close by, as if the entire mansion had undergone a magical makeover. The once jealous and mad maids now bowed to Aram's newfound authority, creating an oddly harmonious atmosphere. However, the mysterious disappearance of the troublemaking maids, including the one who had locked Aram in the bathing area, left an air of intrigue. Isabel, acting serious, ushered Aram to her room and spilled the tea about the fired maids. In a dramatic twist, she pleaded with Aram to keep Duke Millard in check, as he apparently only listened to her. Isabel also revealed Millard's ruthless act of punishing the head maid. With a sense of responsibility, Aram promised to look into it. Someone had to stop Millard's rampage, and why not with a bit of diplomacy? As Aram headed toward Millard's office, she overheard two maids discussing their reluctance to deal with the vampire lord, who was apparently acting like a monster. Vampire problems, right? Inside the office, Millard orchestrated a grand sit-down session, leaving Aram twiddling her thumbs for what felt like hours. Later that night, Millard called Aram outside his room and presented her with the D. But before your imagination runs wild, let me clarify. It was delicious chocolates. Aram graciously thanked the Duke, but something seemed off. Millard's face was downcast, leaving her in a state of perplexed, chocolatey confusion. Millard, feeling hunger creeping in, needed blood. The servants freaked out and hastily grabbed another girl to replace Rosa for Flora's usual blood-sucking routine. The poor substitute was terrified, and Aram, ever the peace ambassador, decided to step in and calm her down. But oh boy, the girl was crying like a broken faucet, which was getting on Aram's nerves. She briefly considered switching from a gentle approach to a slightly threatening one, warning the girl that if she didn't quiet down, the Duke might turn her into a human juice box. Surprisingly, the girl managed to force a shaky smile through her tears, and with a mental eye roll, Aram headed to the Duke's lair. On her way there, she couldn't help but feel like the new girl was a mini version of herself when she first landed in this peculiar palace. When she finally reached the Duke's office, Aram revealed the situation with the new recruit for Flora. The Duke, in all his blood-sucking glory, sauntered over to check on the girl. However, as he approached, he couldn't quite read Aram's expression. Confusion struck him like lightning, and he started getting anxious, worried that he had messed something up. Little did he know, Aram was just lost in thought, reminiscing about her first days in this bizarre vampire palace. As the Duke neared the sobbing girl, something inside him snapped, and he ended up squeezing her neck a bit too hard. Oops. Realization hit him, and he quickly stepped back, regret washing over his vampire conscience. Seeking redemption, he awkwardly asked the girl for suggestions on how to do something nice for Aram. Still sniffling, the girl rambled on about a raise or some cold hard cash. As she spoke, the Duke's super-sensitive vampire nose caught a whiff of blood outside the room. Aram, growing impatient, envisioned the worst-case scenario. Fueled by memories of her own entry into this strange palace, she pulled out a dagger, giving her finger a small cut for dramatic effect. Just as she was ready to storm in like a superhero, the Duke intercepted her. Realizing she thought he was turning the girl into a snack, his delicate vampire ego took a hit. Aram assured him it was just a déjà vu moment, and the Duke, looking slightly wounded, retreated into his lair. That night, like a mysterious nocturnal creature, Millard vanished into the forest without a word, probably to contemplate his vampiric existence. Or maybe just to have a dramatic brooding session under the moonlight, who knows? Vampires, right? You see, Millard, the Duke of Brooding, wasn't really a fanboy, but more like a lonely vampire with a serious case of the blues. His childhood was essentially a vampire version of being grounded forever. He spent his early days locked up in a room with nothing but books for company, practically earning himself a PhD in self-taught reading. Fast forward to adulthood, and Millard became a big-shot duke, but alas, loneliness was still his trusty sidekick. Then one day, his friend Logan spilled the beans about a vampire girl up for auction. Millard's eyes probably sparkled at the idea of finally having a fang buddy to share his woes, but when he snagged the girl, she turned out to be as human as a pizza delivery guy. Now, most people would have gone for the classic throat-ripping move, but not our Millard. Nope, he decided to keep her around and make her suffer just because... why not? However, as they shared a living space, her quirky personality started tugging at his lonely heartstrings. What started as an annoying presence slowly became amusing, and against all vampire odds, she brought a bit of happiness into Millard's undead existence. The next day, Aram strolled into her room, expecting to find Milad, but he was nowhere in sight. A whole week passed with still no sign of the elusive Duke. Aram couldn't help but notice that the other servants were carrying on with their chores as if the Duke's disappearance was just a minor blip on their radar. Puzzled, she lounged on her bed, wondering where on earth the Duke had vanished to and what kind of shenanigans he might be up to. Just as her thoughts were spiraling into a worry-fueled daydream, there was a knock on her door. Lo and behold, it was the Duke himself. Before Aram could even process his sudden appearance, Milad handed her— no, not that type of head. He presented her with the severed head of the slave trader who had captured her. Milad then casually informed her that he had single-handedly taken down the entire slave trader market and liberated her. Instead of jumping for joy, Aram was still processing the situation, her mind struggling to catch up. But Milad misread her expression, thinking she was disappointed. Instantly, he transformed into a full-blown nervous wreck, desperately asking how he could make her happy. His anxiety reached a peak, and in a dramatic fit, he even knelt before her, begging for forgiveness. Aram, completely taken aback by his theatrics, hurriedly pulled him up. But Milad wasn't done. He continued pleading, convinced she saw him as some kind of monster. As a final peace offering, he handed her a recommendation letter, perhaps thinking she wanted to escape his chaotic world. However, Aram waved off the idea, deciding she wasn't ready to leave just yet. Despite all the madness, she realized she wanted to stick around. The next morning, Milad dove into a mountain of letters like a paper-hungry detective on a mission. Aram, now promoted from garbage lady to chief name-cutter, stood by his side, dutifully assisting in the noble art of dustbin duty. As Milad sifted through the stack, he spotted a prestigious invitation from E. Miller. With a casual nod, he expertly tossed it into the not-interested pile. Enter Logan, the bearer of news and the harbinger of concerns, followed by the Pope, who made a grand entrance, fretting over Milad's apparent rejection of an invite from Emperor ECM. Shocked and slightly offended by Milad's nonchalant attitude, the Pope pleaded with him to at least attend the medal-awarding portion of the grand ceremony. Milad, with his usual disinterest, suggested FedEx delivery for the Emperor's medal. In disbelief, Pope informed Milad that the Emperor was so impressed by his slave trader eliminating prowess that he was offering him the second highest medal. Aram, sensing an opportunity, convinced Milad to at least consider attending. Later that night, Aram thanked Milad for liberating the slaves, sharing that it had reminded her of her own captivity. Milad, suddenly connecting the dots, realized that when Aram spoke of her first day in that world, she meant the day she had been captured by slavers. In a moment of delusional glory, Milad asked if Aram wanted to go back home. Aram, grounding him in reality, explained that returning home wasn't an option for her. Milad, misinterpreting her words, sighed in relief, convinced it was a sign of affection. With grand plans beginning to form in his mind, Milad decided to transform their current location into a new home for Aram. After all, why settle for saving the day when you could also redecorate the entire place? The next morning, Duke sat in his office, looking like a corporate slave burning the midnight oil. Aram, stationed comfortably on a couch, couldn't help but notice his pale demeanor. Being the inquisitive soul he was, Milad decided to dive into the mysteries of Aram's past life, asking about her academic endeavors. Aram revealed she was once a shining academic star with dreams of becoming a civil servant. Milad, looking like he'd just discovered a parallel universe, was shocked by her studious past and immediately began comparing her to the students in his world. In a flash of inspiration, or perhaps desperation, he summoned Julio Almas, the librarian advisor, to be Aram's academic mentor. Introductions were made, and Julio handed Aram a question paper so confusing even their translator couldn't make sense of it. The studying journey began in the afternoon, and Aram couldn't help but feel a bit out of her element. Meanwhile, in the maid mess, the head maid burst in with a grand announcement. A function was on the horizon, and all servants could pen down their requests for wages or bonuses. Cheers erupted from the staff, but, in a rare moment of worry, Aram realized she couldn't navigate the festivities alone. Off to Isabel she went, requesting her company for the upcoming shenanigans. A visit to Duke's office ensued, but Millard was deep in a bad mood. Aram, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in his corporate slave heart, shared her festival plans with Isabel, only to unintentionally exacerbate Millard's already grumpy state. The next day, with all servant requests completed, Millard made a dramatic exit from the palace. A curious servant asked Aram why she wasn't joining him for the parade. Baffled but eager for adventure, she decided to ditch the office and hit the festival with Isabel. At the lively festival, Aram went incognito, sporting a hat to keep her black locks and identity under wraps. The whole event was a chaotic whirlwind of excitement. Aram and Isabel, attempting to catch a glimpse of the parade, found themselves sandwiched in the crowd like a piece of meat between teeth. Aram's anxiety levels reached new heights, while Isabel, not exactly a beacon of empathy, yelled at her to toughen up. Meanwhile, at the Emperor's palace, Duke A. Miller encountered the formidable presence of Duke. However, Duke's mood wasn't exactly festive, as he brooded over the idea of Aram enjoying herself without him. Logan, ever the voice of reason, advised Duke against making a scene. Caught in a whirlwind of thoughts about a maid, Duke found himself tangled in emotions. Enter the femboy prince, ready to apologize but equally ready to stir the pot. Inquiring about Aram, Duke grumpily asserted that the prince had no business knowing about her. The prince, with a mischievous grin, tried his best to annoy Duke, who, in a state of confusion, turned on his heel and walked away. The prince, observing this, realized his plan to pique Duke's interest in Aram was working like a charm. Back at the function, as the parade finally kicked off, Duke found himself holding a leash with the head maid on the other end. The head maid became the center of attention for the parade, taking the spotlight while the crowd erupted in cheers, leaving Duke in the dust. Like being neglected by a crush. The parade itself was a dazzling spectacle, and the entire audience soaked up the enjoyment. Once the glitter settled, everyone returned to their usual festival shenanigans. On the way back, Aram couldn't help but inquire about the head maid's strange position with Duke. Isabel spilled the beans, revealing that she was initially Duke's chosen companion because, well, there wasn't anyone else around. Isabel clarified that sitting on a horse with a woman beside you symbolized obedience, and dropped the bomb that she was Duke's original pick. They took a breather at a fried chicken stall where Isabel casually suggested Aram could be the priestess in the parade. Aram, not feeling the whole horseback obedience vibe, questioned the term priestess. Isabel, in her typical straightforward style, recounted a scandalous tale of a viscount who accidentally brought his side piece instead of his fiancée to the parade. The woman on the horse became the equivalent of Saul if young, and a priestess if old. Aram had missed the chance to be the youthful Saul equivalent. Opportunity knocked, but she didn't answer. Isabel then revealed that she was paid to be friendly to Aram, and advised her to sing her praises in front of the Duke. They wrapped up the function with more enjoyment and headed back to the palace. Millard, returning and still fuming over his encounter with the prince, fretted about whether Aram cared about the medal he received. In a surprise twist, he decided to check on her in her room, only to be greeted by like it was his birthday surprise. The grumpy old grandpa Duke didn't seem impressed at all with Aram's excitement. He brushed off her enthusiasm, telling her not to force herself into these things. Aram, determined to make her point, retorted that she wasn't forcing herself, she genuinely wanted to do it. Sensing his displeasure, she quickly apologized and suggested she should leave. Just as she was about to make her exit, Duke halted her with a gruff voice, instructing her to light the candles and share the tales of her day. Reluctantly, they both settled down and Aram revealed every detail. As she narrated, Duke, in his own gruff way, asked if she had fun. She beamed and replied that it was awesome. Tons of fun. Suddenly, Duke sprang from his chair and fetched a sky lantern from another room. He suggested they send it together. They ascended to the terrace, lit it up, and watched it float into the night sky. Aram couldn't help but feel genuinely happy. and it dawned on Milad that, grumpy as he may be, he had managed to bring joy to her day. The next day, Duke surprised Aram with an invitation to the Emperor's birthday. However, apprehension set in as she worried about judgment at this royal event. Duke reassured her, but Aram still feared potential humiliation. Eventually, she agreed, only to realize the celebration was in 3 months, not enough time to master dance and etiquette. During a study session with her advisor, Aram told him about Duke's invitation. Desperate for guidance, she pressed the advisor, who bluntly admitted he couldn't do much. Undeterred, she insisted, and he reluctantly agreed to look into it. After their study session, the advisor spilled all the beans to Duke, who, in his typical grumpy fashion, declared that Aram thinks way too much. The advisor, trying to be helpful, suggested bringing in Ela for etiquette lessons, but that idea didn't sit well with Duke, who promptly told him to stay in his lane. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Nelson apologized, prompting Duke to warn him about the watchful eyes and the need to be more careful. Aram's next study session started a tad early, with a mission to prepare for the upcoming birthday bash. After completing a chapter, the advisor instructed Aram to head to a room on the 2nd floor, East Wing. As she explored, a lady named Evangeline and a nerdy-looking boy, Doran, introduced themselves. Apparently, Evangeline was there to teach Aram the palace waltz. They kicked things off with some knee-bending action and a bit of dancing. Once Evangeline left, another lady stepped in, ready to school Aram in palace etiquette. Come nighttime, Aram's back felt like she'd been in a gaming marathon for hours, tired and aching. She realized Duke wasn't exactly treating her like a pet, but more like a project. The next day, during the study session, the advisor lost his cool with Aram, convinced she'd ruined Duke's reputation at the birthday party. Word of this reached Duke, who summoned the advisor to his office. There, the grumpy Duke unleashed his rage, threatening the advisor for scolding Aram. Desperate to save face, the advisor pleaded that everything was for Duke's reputation. Unmoved, Duke sentenced the advisor to the dungeon, where he would await his punishment. Aram waltzed into the study session, expecting her usual advisor, only to find an empty chair. Puzzled, she headed to Duke's office to seek answers. Duke, with a guilty look, apologized on behalf of the missing advisor, admitting that he had been a bit too stern with her. However, Aram shrugged it off, claiming she could handle a verbal slap or two, since it was all out of concern. While they chatted, Pope made a grand entrance, and Duke's expression instantly plummeted. He promptly instructed Aram to play hostess and entertain Pope in the hall. As Aram approached Pope with the head maid, surprisingly all sugar and spice, expressed her delight at Aram getting cozy with Duke, believing it was softening him up. Aram, caught off guard by the sudden friendliness, just nodded along. Pope, on the other hand, unleashed his inner bargain bin counselor on Aram, asking about her feelings in the palace and dropping the bomb that he too suffered under the missing advisor. Pope attempted some budget therapy before the conversation got too absurd. Just as things were getting awkward, Duke swooped in and sent Aram off to rest. Ignoring Duke's advice, Aram sneakily headed to his office and stumbled upon a smuggling case report. Caught up in reading, she lost track of time. Suddenly, it hit her. It was waltz training time with Evangeline. Rushing to the session, she found herself learning a myriad of hand signals and even got a crash course in how to be intentionally rude. As the night dragged on, Aram, still wide awake, practiced her walking technique in her room. Duke happened to stroll by and spotted her. A grin spread across his face. Maybe the sight of her perfecting her walk was the unexpected highlight of his day. The next day, Duke decided to take Aram to a jewelry shop to flex his diamond knowledge. He showed her a bunch of sparkly rocks and asked her to spot the difference. But to his surprise, Aram couldn't play the spot the diamond game. While Duke disappeared into the back room with the owner, the shop lady popped up like a jack-in-the-box to greet Aram. Confused about the diamond dilemma, Aram asked the shop lady why all the rocks looked like long-lost twins. Turns out, some sneaky distributors had stolen their diamond grinding saw and sold it to the competition. The shop lady was stressing over the rival shop making competitive diamonds faster than a microwave popcorn bag pops. In the middle of this diamond drama, Duke strolled back in and he and Aram made a hasty exit. Outside, Duke, the high and mighty, surprisingly helped Aram onto the carriage. Aram raised an eyebrow, thinking it wasn't every day you see a Duke doubling as a personal chauffeur. But wait. Duke had an excuse ready. He claimed Aram was as fragile as a bubble and he didn't want her spraining an ankle. Smooth move, Duke, but Aram found it a bit odd. She didn't sign up for a Duke and a half. They reached a park, and Duke transformed into a casual stroller, pointing at flowers and whatever else caught his fancy. Unexpectedly, a guy named Damier rushed in, all apologies and drama. It turned out he owned the rival jewelry shop and they had nabbed the saw-stealing scoundrel. Duke, instead of unleashing a wrathful storm, calmly listened to Damier's plea for a contract renewal. To Aram's surprise, Duke spared Damier and walked away, leaving the poor guy in shock. Aram, in her confusion, wondered if Duke's leniency was some strange consideration for her. The emotional roller coaster hit her, and before she knew it, tears were streaming down her cheeks. Duke, seeing the waterworks, got concerned. Little did he know, Aram was having a moment of realization. She'd successfully turned the mighty Duke into a character from a tear-jerker soap opera. The next morning marked the grand finale of Aram's dance preparations, and guess who decided to join the dance floor? None other than the Duke himself. To Aram's surprise, the Duke had some serious moves. It turns out he wasn't just good at ruling a kingdom, he could cha-cha like a champ. After a bit of twirling and spinning, they headed to the Duke's office. In his majestic office, the Duke handed Aram the task of playing Letter Ninja again. But amidst the cutting and snipping, the Duke couldn't help but wonder why Aram seemed as slender as a stick. His frustration bubbled up. He just wanted her to be happy, but her changed attitude had him scratching his head. Driven by a desperate desire to see Aram smile, the Duke abruptly stood up and left the office. He wanted her to be as hearty as a laugh track on a sitcom, not as frail as a dandelion in the wind. Later, Aram received a letter from the prince. An apology letter. The prince wanted to meet her after the birthday gala to propose something shiny and new. Duke, not thrilled about the prince's sudden interest, declared that Aram should handle the situation personally. At the gala, Duke and Aram hit the dance floor twirling like they were auditioning for a ballroom dancing reality show. But just as things were getting interesting, someone interrupted the Duke. While Duke was away, Aram decided to sip on some wine like a sophisticated lady. However, her elegance was short-lived as she started coughing and vomiting blood. The whole place gasped. Talk about stealing the spotlight at the party. In a whirlwind of drama, Duke swooped in like a superhero and caught Aram just as she dramatically pointed at the waiter, blaming him for the poisonous drink. Duke, not one for subtlety, charged at the waiter like a rhino on a mission, delivering a royal beatdown and calling in the cavalry to arrest the miscreant. Escorted to a room, Aram looked like she had 1 HP left, dangerously low on her life bar. Duke had a light bulb moment. He did a wrist-slicing maneuver and started rubbing his blood and Aram's together like some bizarre potion-making ritual. Lo and behold, it worked. Aram regained consciousness, probably questioning Duke's first aid methods. Relief washed over Duke when Aram forgave him for whatever shenanigans went down on their first day at the palace. Upon reaching the palace, Duke tucked Aram into her bed, playing the role of the perfect caretaker. The next morning, Aram woke up a tad bewildered to find Duke chilling by her bedside. He confessed he was worried she might have pulled a Sleeping Beauty, which made Aram feel oddly like royalty. With genuine concern, Duke explained that it reminded him of his childhood fear of his mum snoozing permanently. Cutting to the chase, Duke spilled the beans about the halfway point of the blood transfer. Furious, he confronted Pope, demanding to know why her blood wasn't purified entirely. The conversation quickly escalated into a heated debate about black blood, light, and all things vampire. Aram, caught in the crossfire, sat there utterly confused. Not one for subtlety, Duke turned to Aram, demanding if she was aware that vampire blood coursed through her veins. Pope, grinning like the Cheshire Cat, locked eyes with Aram, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Aram then revealed a secret only the two of them were privy to. She spun a tale for Duke about getting smacked by a carriage, and Pope chimed in with the revelation that her body was a bit of an empty vessel. According to Pope, people could be categorized as either dark or light, but Aram defied such labels. She was like an empty soda can, fizz-free. Duke connected the dots, finally understanding why her hair was as dark as a moonless night, and why her blood had a taste that could put garlic-flavored toothpaste to shame. Realizing he was becoming expendable, Pope was politely shown the door by Duke, who probably needed some space for his brooding. With Pope out of the picture, Duke, in a moment of bossy concern, commanded Aram to take a horizontal position on the bed. However, Aram thought it was a bit beneath a Duke to be playing nursemaid. Duke, showing a surprisingly soft side, insisted he enjoyed their unique dynamic and wanted to take care of her. He even threw in an offer to go back to the way things were in the past, to which Aram, swift as a ninja, shot up from her bed, making it clear she had no interest in that retro nonsense. The next day, Duke embarked on a mission to unmask the villain behind Aram's carriage encounter. The waiter spilled the beans. It was none other than Ian Frayner. In a powwow with Logan, Duke decided they'd relocate right after the birthday gala. Meanwhile, Aram, casually reading the newspaper, nearly choked on her coffee when she stumbled upon paparazzi headlines about her and Duke being the hottest gossip in town. Pope, like a persistent salesperson, tried to convince Duke to postpone his return to the estate until the Advent. Duke, not buying what Pope was selling, shut him down, suspecting Pope's sudden concern had more to do with the fear of being shunned than anything else. Aram, with a diplomatic touch, assured Duke it was okay if it was about him. That night, in a move that could be misconstrued, Duke summoned Aram to his room. However, it wasn't a steamy rendezvous, but a delivery. A page revealing that Ian Frayner had been caught with a forbidden book and was due for a date with the Emperor and the Council.